and they just took away the chariot and put the two riders on the backs of the horses, but the horses are still tethered together.
Yeah, it's super weird.
Welcome to Archaeology Books for Fun, digging books that aren't drier than dirt. I'm your host, Tristan Herenstein. With me, as always, is my co-host, Barbara Clark.
Hello, everybody.
And today, we are doing the third section of the book titled Hoofbeats, all about the relationship between ancient horses and humans. But before we get into that, I want to make a quick shout out. We've talked about Stingray, Tom's Florida before on this podcast, and done another video that is really excellent, and it does tie into some subjects that we have covered in this podcast as well. So this one, it'll be linked in the descriptions, so check that out, but title of Mounds and Middens. And he explores the history of a number of the ancient mounds in his area, and he specifically starts with Crystal River, which is one we talked about before in Frauds, Myths, and Mysteries.
And he reached out to you for that one too, right?
He did. He asked for some clarification on the difference between mounds and middens and what that actually means. So I am quoted in that, but that's not why I'm promoting it. And I specifically liked how he talked about some of the mounds that are no longer in existence and why they're no longer in existence. He did a very nice job of covering that kind of thing.
Yeah.
So yeah, check that out if you want more archaeology and history. That's a great channel. Highly recommend. But yeah, launching us into our section for the day. We are on what's called the third hoofbeat of the book, which is just the sections and kind of the different transitions in human-horse relationships. So the first hoofbeat was all about like really ancient times. Basically, there was a lot of humans eating horses in that period.
That about sums it up. Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then at some point, humans decided, hey, these horses are useful, and the horses didn't quite agree. So we had used them in carts for quite a bit. And then finally, we get to what we think of when we think of horses. And this time we are going to start talking about riding horses on their backs, which is, it seems like a bit of a leap, really.
Sometimes literally.
Yeah, a leap or a fling.
Yeah.
So yeah, like last time, this first chapter here is titled Oracle Bones. And this is the first transitional steps from chariots and carts into riding horses. And so the chariot is spreading throughout the Mongolian steppes and really changing how humans interact with that region. There's areas that were not accessible before. You mentioned last time, we kind of joke about how the wheel changed everything. But when you really sit down and think about it and look at how it actually did change everything,
yeah,
it's pretty remarkable. And so that's kind of what we're dealing with here. We start to finally get some of the Mongolian horse-centric cultures as far as we understand them, and get back to the deerstone culture that we talked about at the beginning of the book, which I think this author specializes and particularly likes this culture.
I think that is definitely apparent in this book, and we can talk about that later.
Yeah.
But one thing I did find fascinating was the environmental aspects of how the changing environment allowed horses to be in certain places, not be in certain places, to thrive in certain places, not so much so in other places, and how it also having horses allowed certain cultures that were almost on the outskirts to gain a certain amount of power.
Mm-hmm.
That was pretty cool to me.
Yeah. Basically, it gave a lot of power to more pastoral societies.
Yeah.
As opposed to the agricultural societies that had so much power before and still did. But was it in this one? I think it was, where we talked about how the wetter, colder times benefited the pastoral societies.
Yeah.
And the drier, warmer times benefited the agricultural societies. When we see the rising power of cultures on the steppes, that is in those times, and that's when we start to see a lot of the Hun invasions and that kind of a thing too.
Yeah. And I think it was also something as a horse person that I found interesting, because I get asked this a lot by people who aren't horse people, is like, why do we trim horses' feet when wild horses and stuff like that don't need their feet trimmed? And I always wondered if early cultures, if they would trim their horses' feet, because wild horses, they don't get their feet trimmed. They just kind of break off in gravel and things that they're walking on a different terrain. But in this chapter, he talked about how they found discarded hoof clipping from this time period. And I was just like, holy cow, that's really cool.
And that's pretty solid evidence for them being more than just food animals.
Yeah, and I guess then was it this chapter where they also started seeing like early signs of like veterinary care, very basic veterinary care, but
Yep.
like somebody pulled a tooth from a horse and stuff
Yeah,
like
they
that.
have some teeth that interfere with the bridle bit.
Yeah.
And sometimes they get pulled, and so they were doing this. This was a pastoral society doing this
Yes.
too, which is cool.
And that goes to show, talking about that relationship between people and horses, you can see when we start kind of caring for them as, I wouldn't say pets because they weren't pets, but as valuable animals, I think that shows kind of a change in how they're viewed in society.
Yeah. One thing that did strike me, so this chapter is dealing with like where are the first signs of people riding on horseback. Kind of like we were doing with the carts before, and there's lots of, here's a sign, but no, this actually doesn't hold up. It's a little bit of that. One of the things he mentions is there was a petroglyph found in 2022 that seemed to connect two different societies. So the Deerstone Horse-Centric Society to another society, and the petroglyph was from this other society, not from the Deerstone Society, but it had like a person riding a horse in it, but they think that this is connected to the Deerstone Society because there's like a chevron and a shield that you see in that culture. I'm like, this book has been pretty good. In other authors, I'd question this more, but from the way it's presented, I'm not entirely convinced that that's good enough evidence to show that is the same or descended culture or anything like that.
Yeah, there were a couple times when he brought up art that I would want to see more than just art.
And I think he's been very good, especially compared to some of our other authors, in like presenting the information accurately, maybe a little too good sometimes. But so I think I trust the conclusion, but just like I said, as it's presented here, is like I don't buy it at what you're saying at the moment.
Yeah, I'm more convinced by like the skeletal changes of the animal itself. Like I know he talks about the changes to their nasal region that show that they had heavy periods of exercise, of exertion, and then the nose, like their nasal bones that were really thin, started to kind of become thicker and remodeled, or whatever you want to call it.
But those are more indicative of chariot or cart use.
Well, I guess bridles could be both, but
there was some new technology that came with horseback riding because you needed more control.
Yeah. Did you understand, Tristan, when he was talking, I think it was in this chapter where he started talking about like they were riding them like they were still attached to a chariot. One person would steer and the other person would, I guess, fight.
Yeah.
And they were attached.
This is an interpretation of some of the art.
Yeah. I was having such a hard time. And I think he even had a picture of the art. And I was still like, I don't understand what the point of this would be, except
the interpretation, as I understood it, was that this was a transitional period between using a chariot and riding on a horseback.
Yeah,
and so they took the idea of having always two teams of horses, and they just took away the chariot and put the two riders on the backs of the horses, but the horses are still tethered together.
Yeah, I just don't understand how. I would want to know how the steering.
Probably similar to on the chariot, I'm assuming, but I don't know.
I just don't know how you could do that when you're on the back of one horse.
I don't know quite why you would do that when the clear, simpler solution is to do one horse.
Yeah. But I guess maybe they were still trying to figure out how to control the horses enough. And, they are herd animals like we talked about. So maybe the theory was if they were together, they would follow each other a little easier.
And we did talk about how they were much more wild and dangerous not that long ago.
It just was weird.
Yeah.
And I guess maybe because they were used to chariots, maybe they were more comfortable being next to each other. And this was like the transition for these horses.
Or maybe it was like an odd snapshot of a very narrow moment.
Right.
Like they only did this for like 20 years, but for whatever reason, we happen to have a carving of this.
Right. Yeah.
And so maybe we put too much weight on it as like, this is just something someone tried out at one battle.
Yeah.
Because
it's weird.
Yeah, it is weird.
I just don't understand.
I wouldn't like to do that.
Yeah, no. I know they also talked about not only did you get different tack and things like that, but you also got different clothing. And they talked about the oldest riding trousers that were reinforced in the crotch area for riding, which I thought was interesting.
Okay, next chapter, titled Horseback, is we finally get some people figuring this out.
No more weird chariot-less riding.
Yeah. And there's a few things that allowed this to happen. So, bridle noseband, which we had some kind of noseband for the carts, but this is apparently different. One thing I noted specifically was selective breeding made them easier to work with. And I said, good Lord, this is better now.
Yeah. It was the whole, I found the tack to be interesting because really in some ways the tack that we use today, you can still see remnants of this stuff in this original tack and modern tack. And a lot of it we consider kind of harsh, but sometimes that's also necessary, unfortunately.
Well, and in this case, remember again, they were more wild.
Yeah.
And they're using them for things like warfare too.
And one of the things they focused on apparently for selective breeding was like focusing on reducing the aggression and
yeah, I would think so.
And like the strengthening the spinal column and the back muscles and things like that for riding.
Yep. So we got a bunch of things. Two key things I think too were the snaffle bit,
which still exists today.
Still exists.
Yeah.
And the framed saddle also came about and was very important.
Yeah, that was very important because that kind of takes the rider's weight off of the spinal column.
Or spreads it out more at least, right? Yeah.
Well, and there's, especially if you look at even modern saddles, there's a space for their backbone so that you're not putting pressure directly on their backbone. And I think that's what he was referring to. At least that's the way I thought of it.
And finally, around 1000 BCE, we start to see some of the first signs of cavalry. So again, interesting to note, we had all that time in history, Egyptians and everything, and cavalry was not a thing.
Right. It was all chariots.
Beyond chariots, yeah. Because A, the technology wasn't there, and B, horses were too crazy.
Oh, and stirrups.
Stirrups?
Along with the saddle came stirrups. Yay!
Yeah, this was interesting. I remembered hearing stirrups were invented in Europe or came about in Europe in a certain time. And here I'm finding out, no, actually, they think they came from China.
Yeah.
China and Korea, I think.
Yeah, China and Korea, yeah.
Is where stirrups actually originated in. They started off as a mounting tool, they think.
Which makes sense. Well, and I think it was also around this time that they were starting to breed taller horses for battle so they could be like up above. So it makes sense that you would have a harder time getting on them and thus need to develop a tool to help you with that.
But if you're carrying your equipment or you're in a hurry or, here's where we talk about the two riders without the chariot. I just have weird in there.
Yeah, it's super weird. I wish like video existed of that because it seems like it would be comical.
Yep. This is where we also start to see multiple coat colors. Not all of the ones we have today, of course, but we start to see a fair few.
I thought it was interesting too because he was talking about how they started to breed them to be taller, and I was like, ooh, what are they thinking? And of course, I ride like sport horses, so they're like 16, 17 hands, right? And they were like 1.4 or 1.45 meters. That's about like 13 to 14-ish hands, and that's like pony size.
Taller. Yeah, and these were the bigger of the options. Donkeys were smaller.
But I thought that was funny.
Yeah, and so when the horse culture started to take off, when people were riding horses, apparently this had a similar effect to when chariots started, and it just kind of caused a ripple of disruption as people who had this technology outcompeted or conquered even or raided other cultures that did not have the technology or didn't have access to the horses.
Seemed like, access to the horses was really, really
that was a
vital.
Big problem for a lot. Yeah. And then eventually we'll see them start to breed some horses that can tolerate different environments more. Yeah, so people are finally riding horses, Barbara.
Yay, my people.
Yeah. So the next chapter is titled Horse People, and this is where that new relationship really starts to begin to reshape the ancient world. We start to see lots of effects, like we were talking about the ripple effects. Quick aside, if you know someone who's into horses and listens on their commute, this episode is probably a good fit. Yeah, so now we're talking all about those steppe cultures, is what this one is really about.
I did like in this chapter where, because there's a lot of mythology and things that kind of start to surround the horse, right? And the horse culture. And I think the author does a really good job of pointing out that archaeology can provide us with like actual physical evidence that may or may not differ from those mythologies, but it provides us with insight into who the people really were. And I think that's one of the biggest strengths of archaeology.
Like we're going to talk about the Scythians at some point here, and we talked about them in our other book, Ancient Civilizations, but I'll mention that when we get to it because I have a note on what chapter that's in. But basically there's all kinds of myths surrounding that culture, and a lot of them, as you'd kind of expect, kind of racist for the time. So they're not actually accurate representations. They are more about how people feel or fear this other culture than how they actually were. So archaeology can get at some of those true stories there.
And I thought it was interesting how, as talking about, like, quote, the barbarians, right? And how certain people, certain groups of people had like these stereotypes made about them. And even back then, right? And how they weren't very technologically advanced and things like that. And I was thinking to myself, wow, people really don't change. But they had some really amazing technologies and they were living these luxurious lives all centered around horses.
Hmm.
I was also it was interesting to me that, like, so much the bits were talked about a lot, and the different metals and things like that, and the different types of bits, like, we talk about specialization, and this but usually we're talking about, like, "Oh, they started making pottery," or "They always started decorating pottery," and this is, like, a whole 'nother level of specialization in archaeology, and I just thought it was neat.
Yeah. I thought it was interesting too how chariots themselves changed because before they had been lightweight, but now that they weren't relied on as much, they started to become heavier
Yeah.
to the point where they're almost exclusively used for racing anymore. They're not actually used for anything other than racing in Rome or Greece. And in Pompeii, they actually found a few horses.
That was cool, and in the stable
Yeah,
too, so
in the
you got to
stable.
see what their stables were like
Yep.
and stuff. Yeah, that was neat.
And some of you might recall we talked about Pompeii in Four Last Cities episode 2 all the way back.
Am I incorrect in this, but wasn't one of the horses that was found actually, like, in its tack, like, tacked up, ready to
It seemed
haul
like they were
something
getting
or
ready to move them
something?
out and get the valuable horses out of
Yeah,
Pompeii and didn't make it.
very cool.
We also talk a bit about the Xiongnu again, which we talked about also last book in the 4th episode of
Yeah,
Ancient
a lot of the
Civilizations.
cultures from our last book keep popping up.
They sure do. I wondered if they would. Took a little longer than I expected, though.
Right.
And this was interesting because that book talked about the Xiongnu quite a bit and gave some details. And this book basically complemented that nicely, what we got from the other ancient civilizations.
Yeah, it did, didn't it?
It filled in some details that the other one didn't do and didn't have details the other one did. Trying to think of at least a couple interesting things. One thing I liked about this chapter in particular, and other books have done this, but I always like when a book does this because some of them have not done it, is they're talking about how when the Xiongnu were really at their peak, they would start to form administrative centers like cities essentially. And local Mongolian archaeologists have actually found one of these administrative centers. And it sounds really cool. And like I said, I thought it was really cool because a lot of times you hear talk about people doing archaeology in other countries, and it's usually Westerners doing archaeology in other people's past.
Yeah.
And so to see this is being done by local people, it just makes me happy to see that.
And I feel like there is a shift happening in the field of archaeology where that's happening more and more, as it should.
Yes, it should.
Yeah.
Yes, exactly. So that's a good thing. It's a good trend, but I like to see it.
I thought it was interesting too how China was kind of slower to adopt the horse because they had a hard time getting their hands on horses and, like, for a variety of reasons, from environmental conditions to just they were hard, like there was almost like not a shortage but just such a demand for horses among all these various cultures. I thought that was fascinating. I don't know.
Yeah. And for reference for people who know a little about China's history, this is during what's called the Warring States period. So you may also know of the Three Kingdoms period. That was a later period. This is a kind of a similar period, but it's much earlier. So if you like good drama, this is also a good period with a lot of
Oh
intrigue
my
and
gosh.
everything going
Yeah.
on.
I did like too how the king ordered the army to adopt the dress and stuff and the tactics of their enemy, wear riding trousers and, shoot arrows from horseback and things like that.
Yeah, so this was one of the rulers of one of the kingdoms.
Mhm.
Yeah. The Qin,
Yeah.
actually. Did
Yeah,
you say
yeah, yeah.
Qin? Oh, I'm sorry, I didn't hear it. Yes. And then I think you were wanting to talk about Qin Shi Huang's temple.
Yes. The terracotta soldier temple.
Yes.
That's how. But yeah, no, when I was in China, I actually had the opportunity to go there. And first of all, it was just fascinating because the terracotta soldiers, they're like individualized. It's not like they're mass produced, but they all have individualized aspects.
Mhm.
And the horses were the same and their tack and everything. It was just very, very fascinating. But there were 150 full-sized cavalry horses there. And I think I sent you a photo. Like the only photo I took there was me in front of some of the terracotta
Of
horses.
course.
Go figure. And this
And
was
I
like
had
20 years ago.
no one is surprised kind of response. Yeah. Next up, we have a shorter chapter, which I was a little disappointed because it's titled The Silk and Tea Roads.
I know there wasn't really any mention of tea, Tristan.
Yeah, I know. I was looking forward to hearing about some tea and how it developed. No, I wasn't expecting too much, honestly.
You just wanted, I was expecting like tea and horses would finally cross paths and I would finally
get me to do horse stuff.
Yes.
Well, honestly, I was looking forward to hearing more about the Silk Road too, because that's fascinating as well, and everything involved in that. And we were talking about the terracotta soldiers that was at the city of Xi'an, which is a modern city today, but that was the capital of China for a long time, and that's because it's where the Silk Road basically ended. So that is why that was so important and why the capital city was there. We do get some introduction to how horses became utilized in China more. I thought the heavenly horses was interesting.
Yeah.
Essentially, there's Han Emperor Wu Di understood that they really needed some good horses and they needed to start raising horses. So he sends expeditions to try and find some, and they've come across some horses in a valley, and they had basically a heavenly sheen, and they sweated blood.
Which apparently may have been like a parasitic infection.
Yeah, which is super gross.
Gross.
But they thought that was pretty special and a pretty good sign. So there was a lot of effort into gathering those horses.
Yeah.
To a lot of, didn't go well eventually. Eventually they got some, but they had a little trouble there.
It was not,
not smooth sailing.
No.
And then it does finally develop into the Tea Horse Road, which I understand to be in a more southern Asia type of a trade network. Is that what you understood?
That's what it seems like. There was a lot of geographical talk, and I kept having to kind of Google
used a little
things.
Bit of a map to help me out with some of
Yeah,
this.
a map would have been handy, honestly.
But yeah, so this was critical because essentially it sent tea to Tibet, and Tibet was sending one of their trade goods returned was horses.
Yeah, good trade.
But like I said, that's a short chapter.
It was interesting, though.
All right, so for this next chapter, there's a lot of detail. Clearly, like I said before, clearly this author really likes the steppe cultures.
Yeah, it's funny because you get these little short chapters, and then anytime it's a steppe culture, it's like...
Right, the Silk Road
info dump.
Got like a couple pages.
I know, which is crazy.
Right, but I get that we're talking about horses, too. This really starts to take off with the steppe cultures, and we start to see them expand in power. We see a lot of innovation in the technology from the steppe cultures themselves, including
different saddles and padded saddles.
Yes, this is where stirrups finally come into frame. He talked about some of the early stirrups before proto stirrups, essentially, and how they probably weren't very good, but they kind of led to an actual stirrup at some point.
And he goes into a lot of detail about the climate again and how different favorable conditions like allowed people to garner more power based on how many horses they could raise in their environment, essentially.
Yeah. And I don't need to go over all of these, but apparently there were a series of cities that steppe cultures would eventually develop when they became big enough and powerful enough. So each of them would have some of them. Sometimes they'd be in overlapping places. Sometimes they'd be in different places. I would like to know more about those, though, because they sound really cool and fascinating.
Yeah, that was interesting to me because, like, this is a, pastoral kind of...
society?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of, like, when people move around, migratory society. And so it's kind of interesting that they had all these capitals and things going on. And
I think it's just a matter of they eventually got big enough.
Yeah.
Yeah, I remember we had I don't remember the name of the culture right now. Oh, the Nabateans.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah. So we talked about the Nabateans and the development of Petra because they had been very mobile society, and then they eventually got powerful enough they started to develop a city, which is interesting because, as I understand it, pretty consistently these cities take a very different form than a lot of like other cities.
Yeah, that's what I understand too.
They tend to be laid out more like a camp would.
Which makes sense,
Makes
right?
a lot of sense,
yeah.
But I think that's very fascinating. I'd love to see some more analysis of that someday.
I did think it was
too nerdy.
I did think it was cool in this chapter too. He talks about the written document or written word and how, in this period, it was pretty rare, at least to get like detailed documents and things like that. And so the archaeological data becomes really important in kind of understanding the impact of these cultures. And again, archaeology is important.
Yep.
My motto.
A couple little more facts about Mongol developments, because they they had some interesting stuff. I like the postal road.
Yeah.
60 kilometers of road, 44,000 horses.
Yeah.
That was quite an endeavor. Paper money also had. Anyway, it's just fascinating. Just really cool. All right, so last chapter today, titled Deserts and Savanna Empires. So now we have the horses coming into drier climates, which they are not naturally suited for. And so one of the first things they have to do is they have to start breeding them to be more suited for this environment. And this is when we start to get breeds such as the Arabian horses.
Yeah, which I grew up with an Arabian horse. I can tell you all about those nutty animals.
Yeah, nuttier than normal. Some of the things they were raised to do, though, was like hold their tail higher. I didn't realize that was a heat adaptation.
And their nostrils, like if you ever look at an Arabian horse, their face looks kind of funny. Some people like it, some people don't, but their nostrils are much larger, and that's to help cool them down too.
Yeah, but essentially people started to do that, but also on top of that, they would continue to use camels because camels are just so water efficient. Camels could carry the water for the horses, basically.
Which I thought was so funny.
Yeah.
You have to have animals to carry the water for your animals.
Yeah, and it almost made me wonder why horses at all then.
Right, that's what I was thinking. I guess because their horses are faster and like better in battle than camels, probably more maneuverable.
Yeah, I'm sure they are. And I know we talk about how crazy horses are. I think camels are even more so.
That wouldn't surprise me. But yeah, I know they use them essentially, like it seems like almost exclusively horses, not camels, but I'll use them mostly in battle, in combat.
So yeah, horses go into different regions they've never been in before. They do see some new development of technology as well, including the curb bit, which sounds terrible.
It still exists today.
Yep. But we also see things like bitless bridles and stuff too. And I was interested in this horse body modification predating saddles. That seems to imply like a thing was done to a horse so they could be rideable. But maybe it means more just like wear and tear on the spine that predated saddles.
That's the way I kind of read it.
Because I don't know why you'd say the former and not explain more what that was.
Yeah.
And eventually they do hit a second barrier. In Africa, the horses really do not do well in rainforests. And so they get to the African rainforests and they kind of cannot exist there. They die of disease, parasite, heat.
And being someone who like rides horses in Florida, I was like, not much has changed.
Yeah.
They still like to colic when it gets too hot out.
Florida's probably not the best environment for them either.
No, but apparently they all come here, so.
Yeah. All right, so that is the end of this episode. And I really like that we finally got to kind of the meat of the horse subject, because you think horses, you think riding horses. And it took us a while to get there, but he's made a good case for why there's a good reason it took so long to get there, I think.
Horses were difficult.
Hard. Yeah, and I like that this has given me some new perspectives on history and how this has developed. So
I will try and be more patient when I go riding.
Yeah, you can't help it. You're a little horsey. So yeah, anything you want to add or anything that occurred to you last minute here, Barbara?
No, there were some parts where I felt like he dove really deep, and there are other places where I wish he would have added more. And you could definitely tell what his either specialty or like specific interest is as opposed to other things. But that's okay. We all have our interests, and he's writing the book, so.
Yep, exactly. And it still has a lot of good information in here, I'd say.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So I think that wraps us up for this episode. We'll see you all next time.
Happy reading, everybody.